All right. Hello, everybody. This is Alejandro Rojas with the Rojas Report. Do you happen to have any headphones, Brian? Or maybe I'll.
I don't. I do, but they're actually kind of not working, which is why they're not plugged in.
Okay, that's all right. Because there's just a bit of
Can
an
you hear me
echo, but
okay?
that's fine. Yeah, I can hear you fine. I can hear me fine.
I could put in a little
Echoing a
earbud.
bit.
I
Yeah,
could
that
put
would be
in
great.
earbuds, but would that
That'd
help?
be great.
Okay.
Yeah, that would help. Thank you. So I'm going to mute the mic, but just for a sec while I do this. So I'll explain to you what we're doing here. This is Bryan Bender of Politico, a senior correspondent, also the former editor of the space and defense areas for Politico. And he's been the UFO topic since December 2017. In fact, I don't know who came out first. We'll see what he thinks. Either here's the New York Times, the whole Pentagon UFO project. So we're going to talk to him about, let's see.
Hello?
Hey there. How's it going? Can you hear me?
I'm unfrozen. Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Hello?
Uh-oh. Hello. Can you all hear me?
Now you look frozen.
I'm good. Yeah, they can hear me. Uh-oh. That's what we get for trying to mess with stuff. They can hear you too. I can hear you. So we can all hear Brian.
Hello?
Can't hear me. So let's see. While he gets this reconfigured here. So, of course, the news is that the Senate Intelligence Committee, in their appropriations bill, that's asking for information about UFOs. And Brian essentially broke the mainstream media story on that. Ask him a second how he caught
I don't
wind
hear anything. I don't know if you
of this
can
news.
you wave if you hear me?
I can hear you. Yes. If Brian and I seem a bit familiar, it's because we are. Fortunately, we were able to connect a couple of years ago to talk about UFO stuff. And we've been kind of meeting and talking ever since. Oh, he's calling. So this will be fun. Hey.
Hey, I don't know. I just see you're frozen and I don't hear anything.
Try to join again because we could hear you. You were just fine and everybody could hear me too. Aha. Let's see. Now we can't see you. Here you go. Can you hear me?
Here we go.
All right.
Now I can.
Good to go. Thanks for your patience, everybody.
Sorry.
No problem. Okay, so let's get into it. That gave me some time to kind of catch people up a bit. They're already aware. But so you were the first kind of pretty much in the mainstream media to break this story. How did you come to this information?
Well, actually, I had been hearing sort of some rumors that there was going to be some sort of reference to the UAP issue in the Senate intelligence bill. And that's something I've been hearing actually for a couple of months. And so I've kind of been checking in from time to time. And then, to be quite honest, I don't claim to have broken the story. I think it was Dan Silva on Twitter had posted first the actual report from the committee. And so once I saw that they had actually published the committee's report, and this is a report on the bill. So it's not the actual bill itself, but all of these pieces of legislation usually have an accompanying report that kind of goes into more detail and explains some of the provisions and why the committee's voting for this or voting for that or not voting for something else. And so once I was able to just make sure that was the real thing, we obviously posted a story. But this was something that I think was in the works really for a couple of years.
Yeah, interesting. Steve McDaniels, he's the other guy who broke this on Twitter. He's actually, I think, in the chat here too. So he has some questions, but that's kind of interesting that it came kind of from the UFO world then to you, even though you had heard some rumors. Why do you think that's purposeful? Do you think it was a bit hidden away, like they didn't want attention to that particular part?
No, I mean, my sense is just those guys are on top of things and just, got a hold of it or got word of it before I did. And, a lot of times these committee reports will get sent to the government printing office and, sometimes it takes a couple of weeks till it actually gets published and posted. I think in this case, the committee actually approved the bill 2 or 3 weeks ago. So, it was just sort of the lag time until they actually printed the report. But, there's obviously a lot of people interested in this issue. And I've been one who's come at it, as you know, Alejandro, pretty late. In other words, I've covered the Pentagon, I've covered the military, but I haven't necessarily covered this issue all that long. And so, those guys who are obviously researchers who focus on this a lot more, it's not surprising that they would be on top of it.
Now, you say that you've kind of heard rumors for the last couple of years. Where did these rumors? Are these like inside rumors? Are these rumors, in Washington where you're hearing this sort of thing?
Yeah, I mean, this was from sources on Capitol Hill and also, quite frankly, to the Stars Academy, the Chris Mellons of the world, the Lou Elizondos of the world, who, it's no secret, have been advocating that the government do more, pay more attention, throw more resources at this issue. And so I think where the interest really began in Congress was with some of these briefings that members of Congress were getting on the sightings by the Navy pilots over recent years. And I think it's about a year ago that we reported that the Senate Intelligence Committee, or several members of the committee, had been briefed about some of those reports in a closed session. And that included Senator Mark Warner of Virginia, who's the vice chairman of the Senate Intelligence Committee, the leading Democrat. I believe Senator Jeanne Shaheen, I had spoken to her about some of the briefings that she had received. And I'm pretty sure that Marco Rubio, who now chairs that committee, was also among those who got briefed. And I had heard that he was among those that was most interested in it, that it alarmed him. I think he comes at it more from a national security perspective. What are these things? If they're violating military airspace, shouldn't we be a little more alarmed about them? And so from what I'm told, it was his staff, obviously with his direction, that really took the lead on putting this provision in the bill that would require this report, this public report.
Interesting. Now, I think, some of the questions I've heard, and you'd probably get this, is that the president, of course, was asked by his son about UFOs recently, and he mentioned Roswell. And so some people are speculating that this is kind of a new campaign gambit on the Republican side to get Trump, reelected, which it may be true as far as Trump mentioning it. But I think people are suspecting that maybe Marco Rubio is trying to kind of back him up on this, and it's a whole campaign thing. But that doesn't seem to be the case, in that, as you just said, Marco Rubio seems to be actually concerned about the, the threat issues.
Yeah, it's hard to know. I mean, I don't get a sense from my reporting that it's as coordinated or connected. I mean, obviously, the issue itself has, I think you would probably agree, has broken through in sort of in the mainstream media, in the public conversation over the last couple of years in a way that it hasn't, at least in a long time. And I think that's driven more questions to the president, who's been asked a couple times in interviews about this issue. He hasn't said much, quite frankly. I mean, there's a lot of headlines when they ask Trump about it, but when you look at what he actually says, he doesn't usually say anything at all. And so, I think there's just genuine interest and less of a stigma for the political leadership to talk about this and raise questions about this. And so I don't know that there's, any coordinated plan here. I mean, I may be wrong, but I'm not sure there's, the political sort of class thinks of a UFO vote. Is there a UFO vote out there like that we could get if we talk about this more or reveal more or, be more transparent? I mean, I know it's of intense public interest, but, I'd like to see a poll that would rank where UFOs sit or, where this issue sits on, the economy, education, foreign policy. I'm not sure that it's up there, but maybe I'm wrong. I mean, maybe there is, a a level of support you could get politically by talking about this more.
Yeah, it's interesting because I had those same questions when John Podesta was kind of pushing for Hillary Clinton to address the UFO issue way back when. If they had done some sort of analysis, because they do so much number crunching on those campaigns, if they had found some sort of, numbers that supported the idea to push this issue as into the campaign as far as openness, but who knows? So then when it comes to Rubio and them asking the questions, it seems as though they were very influenced by Chris Mellon, I would guess, by firsthand discussions with him. And I was wondering if you have some insight on that, but also because he wrote that op-ed in The Hill where he kind of suggested that the Senate Intelligence Committee do just this.
Yeah, I mean, there's no doubt that Chris Mellon has had a huge role in this. He's a creature of Washington. He worked on the Senate Intelligence Committee. As you know, he was the minority staff director a number of years ago. He obviously had his perch in the Pentagon. He's been writing op-eds. He's been doing interviews. You mentioned the Hill op-ed, which is probably, I bet it's maybe a year ago by now. Maybe it's not that long ago, but if you look at that Hill op-ed and you look at the language that's in the Senate intelligence bill, it's pretty similar. He's been calling for, at least as a first step, let's figure out who knows what and what data is being collected, not just in the military, but in intelligence agencies, and let's centralize this somewhere. Because I think, the point he's always made is that there's no real uniform process, at least that exists today, that he knows of, that pulls the common picture together. What do we know? What reports are coming in from where? Who's collecting them? Are they, being put into some single place? And I think the answer to that is no, they're not. And so I think he's been pushing this as a first step. Let's pull it together somewhere, make these agencies talk to each other, share information, put it in one place so Congress can see it. I think what's most interesting about this language is making it public, or at least there being a public version of it, which I think is not necessarily something that I expected. I mean, I certainly was not that surprised that they took this step, but the fact that they wanted it to be public.
Now that is an interesting part, because in Mellon's article, he said he suggested it would be fine if the report was classified at whatever level they felt it should be. However, this is asking for a public part. Do you have any suspicion or any ideas of why they included this, what Adam Kehoe is called, and he mentioned this in his article, and he just mentioned it in the chat, kind of stronger language than Mellons? In other words, that they are calling for this public portion.
it's hard to know. I mean, unless, we could sit here and talk to, I think his name is Brian Walsh, is the staff person for Rubio, who I'm told has sort of taken the lead on this. I mean, without talking to him and knowing exactly what their thinking is, you could look at it two ways. You could look at it as, oh, this is stronger. It's forcing it, a public report where, you can't just put it in some secret document and bury it. But you could also look at it the other way, where it's weaker in some ways, because if you're an overseer in Congress, you can see everything, presumably, if the agencies are willing to tell you and share with you what they know. But a public report, what I worry about is that it becomes a 3-page nothing burger that, is not much more than we already know. I think it's going to be difficult to do it that way because of the way the language is written. It's very specific about what you need to look at and the questions you need to answer. But I've been around long enough to know some of these public reports end up being answering the mail by writing something, but the something doesn't really give you a whole lot. So I think whether this is stronger or weaker, I think is to be determined. Number one, whether this thing gets adopted by the full Senate, because it's just in the committee's bill right now. I think it'll be very difficult for the Senate to strip it out because it's, when it goes to the floor, because it's very public now. We know this is in there, which is not always the case. In fact, it's rarely the case with the intelligence bill that we know is in there. The public version of it is usually, not very exciting. So if they pull it out, people will wonder, well, why are they pulling it out? They're going to have to explain that. And I think, quite frankly, it's not that the issue is controversial, but the process is not that controversial. All they're asking for is a report. They're not allocating money to go research UFOs. They're doing the bare minimum, but in this case, the bare minimum happens to be a big step because of the issue.
So here are some other ideas on the public side that I was thinking of, and I'd like to hear your thoughts. Could it be possible that they might be gauging I guess all of these agencies on how much they're willing to share publicly, or B, they're also gauging their constituents' temperature on all of this to make sure they're kind of hedging their bets as far as, politically?
Yeah, I think it's there's no doubt it's a test of the agencies on a couple fronts. I mean, one, are they just simply willing to share information, even with the committee, let alone the public? And so I think on that score, it'll be hard to know exactly what goes on behind the scenes, but I can imagine there will be pushback. I mean, there will be agencies that don't want to share information. The CIA, the Pentagon, variety of other agencies, they're notorious for sort of, sitting on their own turf and not wanting to share things. And so that'll be a test, just how much are they willing to cough up. I think the other, I think the other test they're doing in this process is, and this gets back to what I said earlier about Chris Mellons' sort of campaign here to centralize what we know, is just simply answering that question. What do we know? I mean, what do these agencies actually have readily available, in terms of recent intelligence data that has to do with this issue? And I don't think we really know the answer to that. I mean, I know there's sort of deep suspicion and good reason to be suspicious that the government does know a lot more than they're telling us. That there's files somewhere, there's radar images, there's videos, there's testimony. And I'm not saying I doubt that. We really don't know, because this world is so secretive. And that could end up being a real problem here, because I envision that it's quite possible some of these agencies, because of the stigma of the issue, because nobody wants to be the UFO guy, that at least in recent years, they haven't collected much. Doesn't mean that there haven't been reports. It doesn't mean there haven't been sightings or unexplained phenomenon that, people scratch their heads about. But I don't know that we have any real confidence that there's been a reporting process for it to actually retain that stuff in some place. And so it may end up being very haphazard, which of course will immediately lead a lot of people to be, well, they're hiding things. They're covering up. They're not telling us what they know. And I think all can be true. In other words, they can be resistant. The agencies can be resistant in coughing up what they do have. But I also think there's a possibility that at least in recent years, the last 10 or 20 years, they might not have much data at all because they simply didn't keep it. Or, nobody was tasked with being the UFO person. Maybe I'm naive. I mean, maybe every one of these agencies has a UFO person and they're sitting on piles of stuff that they don't want to share. But, this is at least a way that we could start pushing that issue and seeing what's really there or what isn't there. Right. And if it isn't there, why isn't it there? I mean, if there are reports, and that's the second step here is maybe, in the bill actually touches on this, is tell us what is the process for centralizing this stuff? Who's in charge? They want to know that too as part of this report, not just what do you have, but how do you gather it? Who gathers it? Where does it go? Do you need more resources? I think there's a question in there that asks, do you need more resources or research dollars to get at this issue? So,
somebody, Adam, raised a good point here, and I guess what I'm going to get at is similar in that it does seem like, to your point, not all these agencies are on the same page with all of this. For instance, the Navy has said essentially they've recently beefed up their reporting process regarding UAPs, and story that you broke actually in Politico. Just recently, I think as recent as yesterday or the day before, John Greenwald got a response from a FOIA that had indicated that the Air Force had said, we don't have a particular UAP reporting process, but it is included in our OPREP reporting, which is kind of how you flag the importance of different intelligence reports that you're sending up the wire. So there's a big difference there. And kind of like what you're saying is that, it seems like the Navy might have been a little more coordinated about it, whereas the Air Force wasn't, kind of surprisingly. So we may see vast differences throughout these agencies because they are asking for all of these agencies to report. And they even kind of called out the FBI, which is interesting.
Yeah, I thought that was interesting too. The reference to the FBI. I mean, I assume they're trying to be comprehensive. In other words, if there are reports, additional reports that we don't know of UAPs, and again, I use the term UAPs very broadly. I mean, as the military does. It could be something that looks like a flying saucer, or it could be a drone that doesn't have permission to be flying over our Navy base. But in a case like that, if there was a sighting of some unauthorized intrusion, because it's domestic U.S. territory, or in the case of domestic military base, you would call in the FBI potentially to come in and figure out who's screwing around with their drone. And so I think that's one of the reasons why they want the FBI to be part of this too. How many times have they been called in for, investigating these things? I also think, I'm just looking at some of the questions here. I think the reason why the committee keys in on the Navy's task force is that, that's been the organization that has been briefing the committee about the Navy pilot sightings. It's out in the public. I mean, we know the Navy's been talking about the new guidelines that they've issued for people to report these sightings. Clearly, they have at least some formal operation that's looking into this. I'm I'm one who doesn't believe it's very formal. I think it's you can put 3 people in a room in the Pentagon and call it a task force and have no budget and no nothing but a bunch of paper shuffling. And I have a feeling that this task force is more that. I don't think the Navy has opened up the budget and said, go, go task force and find the answers. Um, so, the mention of the Navy task force, I think, is just simply because that's a real thing. They know it exists. They've interacted with that task force or the few people that are on it, and um, and even the Air Force. My sense is the Air Force has been deferring to the Navy on this. You guys already have your task force. If we can help, let us know. But I don't get the sense the Air Force. And as a lot of people have pointed out, and a lot of people have wondered, why is the Air Force, which in some ways has a hell of a lot more responsibility for protecting the airspace of the United States than the Navy does, why are they not more involved in this or more public about it? And there's this sort of narrative out there a little bit that the Air Force doesn't want to touch this because acknowledging that there are unidentified aircraft semi-regularly interfering in American airspace, and there's virtually nothing we can do about it, basically is the Air Force acknowledging that they have failed on the primary mission they've been given, which is to defend the airspace of the United States. And so they kind of don't want to go there bureaucratically because it opens up a can of worms that, they don't know how to close. But again, this report is going to presumably, this report that the committee is asking for is going to change that, because all of these agencies are going to have to contribute to this thing somehow, unless they try to kill it, which is not inconceivable that these agencies are not going to want this. And but it would be very hard if it's in the bill for the president to veto, given what he said publicly.
So it's kind of interesting. It makes me kind of chuckle that now we have the Space Force, and now we have the Unidentified Aerial Phenomena Task Force, which seems to be a sort of an extension from ATIP. And I would like to hear your thoughts on that. I think Chris Mellon, or not Chris Mellon, but others have said, it just, and Luis Elizondo has even said that it's become this multi-agency kind of task force. Some researchers, Roger Gassel, I think, got a response from the DoD that said, yes, it is a multi-agency task force now, all confirming that it still continues. But like you said, probably a small group. I mean, Elizondo seemed to be the same. He didn't have a budget. So, he's just grabbing materials and trying to do analysis as he can, kind of like a portfolio, as you put it, which I feel seems very accurate. So, but does this seem to be, the organization that Elizondo's been referring to that's kind of evolved?
I believe so. I mean, I think this task force is kind of the outgrowth of what was ATIP. As we know, ATIP officially, hasn't actually existed in almost a decade. I mean, I think it was 2012 that the budget for that, the original funding stream, ran out. And so I don't get the impression that there's been any dedicated funding, at least in that case of, what was ATIP, which was originally in the Defense Intelligence Agency, but then was moved underneath the Undersecretary for Intelligence. I don't get the sense that there's been any new budget stream for that mission or that portfolio. I think it was one of Elizondo's jobs among a lot of jobs. Intelligence officers often have a bunch of things that they're tasked with doing. And there's no doubt that this was a mission that he took very seriously, and to the point where he was very frustrated that nobody else seemed to care about it. And so fast forward to where we are now, I think the Navy task force grows out of that in the sense that some of the juiciest reports that ATIP had pulled together obviously were originally the Nimitz case in 2004. And then, the Roosevelt doesn't come until much later. It comes after ATIP is gone. But it does happen when Elizondo is still in the Pentagon, still spending some of his time on this. And so, and I think when the Congress wanted a point of contact in the Pentagon, it sort of logically fell to the Navy because the most well-known cases involve Navy pilots. And so the Navy, I think in some ways has taken this on just by inertia, but I also think they've been pressured a little bit by some members of Congress to show us that you're doing something. We still don't really have answers for what these reports going back a number of years were all about. And so, so again, I wouldn't look at the Navy task force as some, big, well-financed group of people that are digging into all these reports. I think it's as much a bureaucratic way to answer the mail and the public demand as it is a true blue interest in getting to the bottom of this.
Mm-hmm. Now, this is a good question. Who would likely be the responsible official? It seems as though the request from the Senate Intelligence Committee is laying this in ONI's lap, but Chris Mellon had suggested it be the DNI. Where do you think that'll end up? Because it does seem like they are asking for a more coordinated effort of a central repository.
Yeah, I think the reference to the Office of Naval Intelligence is connected to the task force. I think the task force sits in ONI, or whoever's kind of been tasked with overseeing this issue is at the Office of Naval Intelligence, and so that's why they're sort of called out specifically. But to your point, I mean, the language is very clear that it asks the Office of the Director of National Intelligence and the Secretary of Defense to sort of oversee this, or to figure out how to best do this. And so I'm interested at some point, particularly if this bill gets adopted, or this language in the bill gets adopted, asking John Radcliffe about this. John Radcliffe is the new Director of National Intelligence, who was just put in there. He's a former member of Congress, a Republican. I mean, I'd be curious to know, was he ever briefed on this when he was in the House? What does he think about it? Because ultimately, he's going to be the guy who either, stalls this or runs with it. So I think that's one person who I would, at some point, like to hear more from. And then the Secretary of Defense, Mark Esper. I mean, I don't think he's ever been asked about this issue, at least publicly. So I think. And that's another benefit of this. No matter what this bill looks like in the end, and no matter what this report, if they actually do this report, looks like, and what the public version looks like, I mean, this is another and a pretty significant way to force the issue. I mean, you now have a real requirement potentially in the law for these agencies to address this. And which means we in the media can ask them about it. And we're not asking some esoteric question about, do you believe in UFOs? What do you think about this language? What are you going to do about it? How are you going to do it? And so, I think that's exciting in some ways, because for someone like me who covers Congress, who covers the policy world, this is, a huge piece of meat that's just been thrown into the arena on this issue, which has a lot of interest, and is obviously intriguing, because anything that's got a big question mark over it, especially when it comes to the intelligence agencies, is by definition newsworthy.
Mm-hmm. Kind of getting into the background of the growing momentum, it seems as though that this has kind of been a Chris Mellon strategy that you've been aware of longer than most, I think. To make exactly what's happened, in that, he seems to be definitely an apolitical type of person. His main interest is the task at hand, in this case, to get more visibility and interest. and information out about this topic. And it seems like, from this plan from the get-go, you being involved with one of their kind of targets, as opposed, meaning they put together a package of material with Elizondo, initially trying to get this up the ladder to Mattis and others. That didn't work. So then it became kind of a media strategy to package together some sexy videos and some information to entice the media to cover this. They hit it with New York Times, yourself. I think Washington Post came out with a story the same day, which created this fervor, which then made the DoD Navy respond. And then finally, kind of the Navy perhaps it seems purposefully opening Pandora's box by admitting that we do take these seriously and we do take these reports, at which point there was kind of this tool now for the politicians or even public citizens to request information. Okay, you're looking into UAPs. First of all, I think this is a pertinent question that hasn't been asked, why you've been lying to the public for all these years. But second of all, what have you got? What have you gotten? And now there seems to be this sense, and Chris Mellon has even tweeted this, that the Senate Intelligence Agency is like, why haven't you told us about this? You're supposed to brief us on these things, and you haven't given us any information, and now we want information. It does seem like a very savvy kind of plan that was put into place that has been successful.
Yeah, I mean, first off, I don't know that I have any unique insight into Chris Mellon's role. I mean, obviously, I've interviewed Chris a number of times, going back to the beginning of this saga in 2017 and the revelations about ATIP. But, it's not rocket science when you have someone like him who's a former Senate Intelligence Committee staffer, a former Pentagon official, who's the most public, probably, at least of this sort of establishment class about this issue and hammering on this issue, through op-eds, through interviews on Fox News, that he's had a big role in sort of shepherding this thing through. And he's been pretty clear about that. I mean, he doesn't hide that.
Right.
That he thinks this is an important issue and it's not getting enough attention. And like we said earlier, I mean, he's the one who wrote the op-ed that basically laid out what this report that the committee is now asking for should look like. And so I think, when the history is written about this issue, and obviously we don't know the ending yet, I think Chris Mellon will have played a very instrumental role in this, because he is the rare, not completely rare, but relatively rare person who has the connections within the intelligence community. He's taken seriously, has a reputation, who's taken on this issue, and he's been able to move the ball, I think, down the field in a way that no one has, at least in a very long time. And I give him a lot of credit for that. I mean, I think he's genuinely, I got the impression that there was a time over the last couple of years where he was getting pretty frustrated and about to throw in the towel. Like, in other words, there's been some revelations, there's been some discussion at the highest levels about this issue and why it should get more attention, but then it sort of kind of fell off the radar. But I think this will only embolden him, probably, this victory of sorts, to keep pushing. I don't know if that answers your question, but
It does definitely. But I'm trying to gauge also, how strong is this momentum? How strong is Marco Rubio's intent to get information? And this is just one tool. I would imagine, let's say this doesn't work, they have other tools in the toolbox that they can utilize. Now, there have been other people in Congress who have asked questions and haven't gotten a lot of answers, but of course they're not coming from the Senate Intelligence Committee. So do you think there is momentum that even if this doesn't work, that they're going to keep pursuing this issue?
I think that's a good question. How how deep is this reservoir of interest, particularly among policymakers who can make a difference, who can force the issue. I'm not sure I have a good answer there. I mean, I feel like, number one, we're in the middle of a pandemic, an economic meltdown, lots of other problems that are on the agenda. This is not one that a lot of members of Congress are running around thinking about every day. They're just simply not. And it's really, really, really hard to get Congress's attention on anything. And so just prefacing that, I think, is important. Number two, I think there is momentum, but I think it's probably among a very select few members of Congress that really care about the issue, who have been briefed about it or have on their own gone out of their way to educate themselves and feel like it does need to be addressed. I think they tend to be hawkish members of Congress. And by hawkish, I mean they're focused on national security. They're big supporters of defense budgets. Marco Rubio is a hawk. I think he comes at this issue with an open mind, clearly, but he's also thinking these are aircraft or spacecraft or something that are potentially threatening to our military. And why are we not more alarmed about it? I think the same goes for Congressman Mark Walsh in the House, who's retiring this year, but he's come up because he wrote a few letters to the Navy. He was demanding more answers. He sits on the Homeland Security Committee, and I think he's very animated about it. He's not a committee chairman, so he doesn't really have a whole lot of, a ton of influence in this issue. But and then some of the other members of the Senate Intelligence Committee, clearly Mark Warner, as the vice chairman, must have supported this provision that Rubio got into the bill. And so I don't feel like there's some groundswell here. It's sort of like, it's in many ways, it's a rear guard action. It's a very plodding, step-by-step, 2 steps forward, 1 step back, then just standing in place for 9 months with nothing happening, and then you take a step forward. I think that's how a lot of things get done, quite frankly, in Congress. Unless it's a bill that is responding to something like police reform and needs to be dealt with now, you don't really get momentum on anything unless there's a crisis. And right now, there's no crisis in UAPs that we know of. And so, I think the rear guard action has been launched. I think there's no doubt about that. But how many troops are involved? How many members of Congress are going to push for this? And not just push to get this bill passed, but ride roughshod over the agencies to actually get a real report done. Because it's one thing to say, give me the report, but they could sit on it, they could delay it, they could, like I said earlier, they could deliver some public version of it that doesn't really tell us much of anything. They could also just write a report saying we went back in our files, and like you and I, when we FOIA things, they could say, well, we didn't find anything. Sorry. Right. But again, at least that's something. At least it's forcing them to address the issue. And maybe the ultimate answer here is that if there are reports, even if they're not collected in some centralized way, reports of these UFPs and more recent reports, maybe the next step is to actually put some money towards it. The Congress could step up and say, well, you need dedicated resources to do this. And so I think we're in the beginning of a very long process that could also completely die in the next Congress. Mm-hmm. A whole new Congress comes in, potentially new committee chairs. The Democrats could take over, and Marco Rubio is basically powerless if they win the Senate. So there's a lot of unknowns here, but I wouldn't count our chickens yet.
It is an interesting question because, let's say, of course, Trump has made a couple comments around UFOs, but not a lot. If Joe Biden becomes president, Podesta may have a role in his presidency, and Podesta certainly is very interested in the topic. So maybe he would push something forward. But what about the House? How interested? Do you have any sense at all how the House, their reception to the bill has been?
That's interesting. I mean, I asked Adam Schiff about this issue last summer. I was in an event, the Aspen Security Forum. They're not doing it this summer, but every summer the Aspen Institute invites all the muckety mucks from national security circles out to Aspen, and they have a couple-day conference. And Adam Schiff was one of the speakers, and I was moderating a panel. After one of the sessions, I was chatting with him about a bunch of things, and I said, "Hey, this issue has been bubbling up." And he didn't say much, but he did say that there's no doubt there are members of my committee that are interested in this. I have not personally been briefed. He said he had not gotten a briefing about the Navy sightings. And again, this is a year ago. This is July of 2019. But he said that several members had, and that he had hoped to, or he had planned to. And, he said, I don't know what to make of it. It's kind of interesting. It's certainly, something that would fall under our purview we should look into. And so he didn't dismiss it, but he also didn't give me the impression that he was like paying much attention to it, quite frankly. Maybe that's changed, but he did clearly suggest that there were members on the House Intelligence Committee that were interested. So the way this will work is the Senate will pass its intelligence authorization bill. And again, this is a massive bill that is, supposed to set policy for all the intelligence agencies on everything you can think of under the sun. It's a mostly classified bill. The House will pass its version, and then they'll have to have a conference committee. So the House and the Senate will pick a number of members that will then go in a room and look at the Senate version of the bill and the House version of the bill and basically try to marry it, sort of come up with a common version. And so if there are provisions like this one that are in the Senate bill but not in the House bill, they have to discuss that. Do we leave it in? Do we take it out? Do we change? They can also change it. Not in the conference committee, but they can change it on the floor. So, Senate votes for the Senate intelligence bill, House votes for its own version. They then marry it together. Then they both have to vote on the final bill again. And so there's a bunch of steps here that have to take place. But, if there are members of the House Intelligence Committee that care about this issue, as Adam Schiff mentioned, some of those members could be potentially part of that conference committee that has to come up with a final bill for both houses of Congress to pass. So, I said earlier, I think it'd be very difficult to take this out. Not impossible to take this language out. But, the Senate, the full Senate still has a chance to take it out on its own without even worrying about what the House thinks. Right. I mean, when they debate the bill on the floor, they could change it. They could make it a completely classified report. I could see that being a possibility where somebody might say, well, since we don't know exactly what we know, don't we want to make this secret so that we're not revealing any, and the committee sort of alludes to that challenge a little bit in the language. If you remember, they make some reference to, we know that this is sensitive stuff potentially, but yet we still want a public report. And so you could see some people raising questions about how public it should be. Because usually in these cases, the report is secret, and then they have an unclassified annex to the report. This is flipped, where the report is public, and you can have a classified annex if you want, or if you need it, which is very interesting. I mean, it's definitely unusual the way they've done this.
So I guess advocates, the best thing they can do is not just contact Marco Rubio, which Chris Mellon has kind of put out there on Twitter, but also their own representatives in the House and the Senate to let them know they're interested, to hopefully influence when they come across it to leave it in.
Oh, you mean like the public role?
Yeah, the public.
I mean, I think like anything else, constituents can write their congressperson. I think at this stage, you'd probably want to write to not just members of the intelligence committees, but the leadership of the House and Senate. So Mitch McConnell, Nancy Pelosi, if you feel strongly about this, they're going to be the gatekeepers on what eventually gets debated by the full Senate and the full House. But it certainly can't hurt. I mean, if people feel strongly about this issue, it can't hurt to badger your member of Congress about it, or ask them in a town hall or a virtual town hall or whatever they're doing these days.
Right. Adam is asking again, do you know that Mellon has any advocates or people he's working with in the House?
That I don't know. I know. I mean, I mentioned Congressman Mark Walsh of North Carolina. I think he's an ally. I mean, and I say that not because I know specifically, but just because he's been very public about this issue, more public than others. So it's possible that he's working behind the scenes. He told me that he was, Mark Walsh told me a number of months ago that he was also enlisting at least the interest of, his name is escaping me now. Is it Andrew or Anthony Rose? A young congressman from New York State. He's a former military guy. Let me look him up here. Andy Rose, who's apparently a military veteran. He's young. He's in his 30s. He apparently cares about this issue. And so, there are definitely, yeah. No, Andy Rose. Why am I not?
Find him.
Oh, I'm sorry, Max Rose.
Max.
Max Rose of New York, who is I think he's just got elected in 2018. Yeah, he's 33, from Brooklyn. He apparently is quite interested in this issue. So I don't know what he's doing about it, but Walsh had mentioned that he was an ally, and I think they serve on the same subcommittee as part of the Homeland Security Committee. And so I just throw that out there because, like I said earlier, I think there are, let's call them the true believers. And by that, I mean true believers that this is a real issue. It's not a conspiracy theory. It's not something to be dismissed and laughed at and joked at. It's a real policy issue that we need to figure out what to do about. Mm-hmm. And so, there are members. But again, has it gotten to the level where, there's huge blocks in the Democratic and Republican Party that are thinking about this? I don't think we're close to that yet.
So have you been vindicated at all? I mean, you writing about a controversial topic. I'm sure you got some raised eyebrows when you started covering all of this. I was surprised when you started covering it with your space symposium that you guys had put together. But now that it's gotten far, do you have some of your colleagues coming to you and saying, "Wow, Bender, I guess you were onto something"?
A little bit. I mean, I always got buy-in from my editors at Politico. I mean, I never really, I mean, obviously at first when I came to a couple of them and said, I think the Pentagon's been doing some research on this issue and, they got some money from Congress, and there was a little bit of the sort of eye rolling. And I think you and I have talked about this before. But I think once it became clear that this was a real project, it had a real budget, and this is the ATIP program, there was never any real pushback. Like, oh, this sounds like a good story. Let's pursue it. But yeah, clearly, over the course of the last few years, there's a few comments here and there. But I've had this discussion. I've been thinking about writing a piece about it. I don't know how familiar you are with the Overton Window, but I only recently came across it. Overton was a scholar, professor, fairly recent. He actually died quite young. I think he died in the early 90s. But he came up with this theory, and it became known as the Overton Window. But think of a window, which is the space where it's acceptable in academia, policy circles, think tanks, congressional committees, any organization that talks about public policy. There's kind of a window of what you can talk about, what's sort of in the window, what's acceptable. And I think in a number of ways, the Overton window has shifted in recent years, or it's expanded. And not just on this issue, where the Senate Intelligence Committee chairman can feel like it's okay to put out a public report. Not talking about UFOs, not talking about aliens. There's no words like that in there, but clearly confronting very head-on an issue of unidentified objects that seem to defy any technology that we know of. The fact that he feels comfortable shows that window maybe of what's acceptable to talk about has expanded or shifted. And I think other examples of it are, all over the place. Free college. I think 5 or 10 years ago, if a presidential candidate talked about free college, they would be laughed off the stage. Like, what are you talking about? We don't do that. That's not acceptable. The sort of establishment education experts would say, oh, that's crazy. Well, that's not crazy anymore. I mean, Bernie Sanders talked about it. Elizabeth Warren has talked about it. People are proposing actual ways to do it. And so I think the Overton window is moved on this issue. I think it's a combination of just access to so much information that's out there. I think the younger generation is more open-minded about a lot of things. And that includes younger generation members of Congress. I mean, I just mentioned Max Rose. He's 33 years old. He doesn't necessarily have the baggage or the scar tissue on an issue like this that maybe, members of Congress from our generation or when we were growing up do. And so, that presents an opportunity where you can talk about things that were sort of written off before, or at least written off in recent memory. I mean, as you know better than I, and I find it fascinating when I read some of the history of the UFO issue, there were actually members of Congress that actually cared about this issue, even years ago, and wrote memos about it. And I forget where I saw, I think he was the Speaker of the House, John McCormick, in the 1960s, was on the record talking about this issue. Like, there was a lot of reports, and he said, we should be doing more about this. And of course, as far as we know, nothing really happened. But so, I think we're in a new era, but it's not completely new. I think we need to keep in mind that there have been public officials that have, you mentioned John Podesta, there have been public officials of note that have been willing to talk about this issue. I just think we're in an era now where more are willing, and they don't see it as political suicide, to be the UFO person or the UAP person. But I think John Podesta, I mean, in a Biden administration, if Biden wants a national commission to get to the bottom of this, John Podesta would be the perfect person to run it.
No doubt he's worked with him very closely, and he was around during a lot of Podesta, Washington UFO hijinks type of stuff that was going on when
some people think he's an alien himself.
Yeah, I think me too. So I have a couple questions from the chat, and one was along the lines of your last. It's kind of along the lines of what were the Senate briefed on, what information they get. Steve asked, do you think that the Senate Intelligence Committee was shown credible evidence to justify including that verbiage in the report, especially if you consider the stigma involved with the UFO UAP topic? It seems they were willing to include it at the risk of public and political scrutiny.
I'm sorry, I'm trying to find the you cut out there for a second. Can you
sort of
quickly repeat that? Or I'm trying to find the actual.
Oh, it was different.
I can hear you now.
Thing, but I'll post it here so you could read it too. It's from Steve.
Oh, great.
But yeah, do you think that I have another question tool here they can use? So,
I mean, I think they were. I mean, the short answer is I don't know. I mean, I don't know what exactly the Senate Intelligence Committee, learned, what they were briefed. But, I think, trying to think of it this way. I mean, if you were a member of the Senate Intelligence Committee, or I was, and I was sitting there and a bunch of Navy guys came in, including, it sounds like in one of the briefings at least, one of the pilots who had actually made one of the reports came in and gave you this very detailed, credible sounding report about what we're seeing, why we can't explain it. You might, and then you saw the 3 videos that the Navy put out. I mean, it's just human nature. I mean, they might be like, wow, what the hell is that? Like, why do we not know what those are? And so I'm not ready to assume that they know anything a whole lot more than we do. I mean, as I said earlier, oftentimes, even though they're not supposed to be the last to know, the oversight committees in Congress are the last to know. In other words, especially when you're dealing with intelligence agencies, they don't necessarily, give up the goods on their own unless they need to. And so I don't get the impression that the Senate Intel Committee knows anything more than we do. I mean, they do know more than we do in the sense that they have a clearance and they can see classified documents that we can't get. Maybe they saw the actual reports, which we've been trying to get through FOIA. Like, what did the pilots actually see? What did they say? Where are the interview transcripts? I've asked for the more recent reports since last year when the Navy came up with these new guidelines for reporting these. Well, what have they gotten? Have people actually reported them? And haven't really gotten anywhere. So, it's possible they could have seen those or some version of that stuff that we in the public haven't seen. But I think there's enough out there in the public that if you're open-minded about this, and open-minded doesn't mean that you believe in aliens. It just means that you believe that there's credible people that are reporting things that we can't explain. There's enough already out there to take the next step, which is, well, what else do we know? Should we be doing more? Should we be asking more questions? Should we, be interfacing more with our allies about this issue? Because, that's something that comes up a lot, which is interesting to me, is that we seem to be behind the ball on this. Like, in other words, a lot of other countries have gotten over their Overton window has, been opened a long time ago, where they talk about this more openly. But what's interesting is I don't get the sense that they have a whole lot more answers than we do. I mean, you would know more than me, but
no, I agree.
Have they cracked the code on this? I don't think they have.
I agree. I mean, we have the UK. I mean, we have quite a bit of insight into what they were examining, which is very similar to us. And they didn't really take a stance. The only real government that's taken a stance is Chile, but Chile analyzed cases that they had that are similar to ours, similar that you find in Blue Book, or similar to the Nimitz situation, where essentially an object is tracked, jets are scrambled, the object flies off, the jets come home, and essentially they've determined that they don't seem malicious, like they want to hurt us, but that there's something there. So I think you're right about that, personally, at least from what we've seen of what the other governments know.
And I also think that drives some of what I sense, at least from where I sit, is not really a lack of interest in this by the military, but a sort of a sense of resignation that, is this really worth looking into? I mean, if I had a dime for every time somebody told me the Air Force looked at this for 40 years and they found nothing, why would we do that again? Which, is sort of a lame answer because, there's always new information. There's always fresh evidence or data that you could look at. But I get the sense that there's a resignation that we're never going to figure this out. So, like, why waste our time? And they're not threatening. They don't seem to be. They're not shooting down our aircraft. They're not blowing up our nuclear power plants. And so I think that's a big part of it. I had a conversation. I think I've shared this with you. This was not something that I was able to use on the record, um, but I've talked to enough senior people in the Air Force and the Navy to get a pretty good sense that they don't think these aircraft are foreign adversaries. And they don't think that there's some secret US government plane. And some of these people I've talked to who don't want to go public, they have access to a lot of the deep, dark, black programs. They can go in, they're super users, as they're called. They can go into the systems and have a pretty wide access view of what are the secret programs we got going on. And I don't get the impression that they think it's one of ours. They don't think it's one of theirs. Because I think if they did think it was one of theirs, they would take it more seriously.
Right.
I mean, if they thought it was Russian or Chinese, I mean, they'd be running around with a chicken without their head. I mean, asking for $1 trillion more, for more hypersonic missiles and more defenses and more. And they're not doing that. And I think it's because they don't know what the hell they are.
Mm-hmm.
And they don't really have a ton of confidence that they're going to figure it out. And maybe some of them don't want to know, because it's sort of like, I don't want to go there because it will upend potentially everything we're all about. We'll have to go back to basics. And a clean sheet.
You ran across this similar to what you just said. Even, a lot of people think there's some kind of deep, dark, hidden reservoir of secrets. Even if that is the case, the majority of the military, and this is my experience from interviews and similar to what you're talking about, the majority even of leadership in the military are kind of like, well, there's something out there. We don't know what it is, but we have no ability to even figure it out. Nothing I'm going to worry about. But at the same time, they have an attitude that even though that's my attitude about this topic, I don't want to share that with the public. I don't want the public to know I'm taking this seriously, and I'm just resigned to the idea that I'm never going to find out.
Right. And we've talked about this before too, but I do think I think it's quite possible that there is information to be known that the government has. And if at all possible, it would be nice for, assuming it doesn't, risk national security, it would be nice for us, the public, to be able to know that. But at the same time, while I think there might be things in there hidden, I'm not convinced that the people who run these agencies know the stuff is there.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, you have to remember, these agencies are massive. Oftentimes, even within the agencies, they're not talking to each other, let alone sharing information with another agency. And so, and then there's the whole question of what records are retained. By law, these agencies are not required to keep a lot of things. They're just not. It's a small percentage that they actually have to keep. So imagine now in the electronic age, as opposed to the paper age, where you just clean off a hard drive because I need more space. Or, as opposed to writing up a report and sending it to some functionary who then sends it to the National Archives or it gets filed away. I feel like we also live in an era where even with all the information we have, our government's not doing a very good job of retaining it. I mean, they're getting better, I think. The National Archives has put out a lot of new guidance in recent years about how to maintain electronic archives. But I always tell the story about an Army historian who I once talked to, who said, goes back 5 or 10 years, but he said, I can tell you where every American soldier was during World War II, virtually every day, where they were, within 5 miles of where they were standing. But if you want me to do a recounting of the Battle of Sadr City in Baghdad in 2004, I can't tell you anything, because all the hard drives of those units were wiped out when another unit came in and replaced them. Now, granted, I could go interview the kids who were there, who fought the Battle of Sadr City in 2004, and interview them in a way I can't interview World War II people. But I don't have a paper trail the way I do for things that happened a lifetime ago. And so I just throw that out there because I think there's this misimpression. And I sometimes fall trapped to it too, that somehow the government just has miles and miles of filing cabinets of stuff they're hiding, and no doubt they are, but it's not miles and miles. It's like, your living room full, and they're in places that a lot of the senior people don't even know that they're there. They've never read them. They've never looked at them. They wouldn't even be able to tell you what's in there. And so that's one of the things that's beneficial about this, getting back to the report that the Senate committee wants, is at least it's a first start in, okay, we haven't really had a government-wide investigation of any of this stuff, at least in almost 50 years, right? When did Project Blue Book end? At least that we know of.
Yeah.
But I got to think the CIA's got stuff. I've got to think the Air Force has stuff, even if it's just random, haphazard here, there, everywhere. And it would just be nice to pull all that together and see, is there a picture, more common picture, or is it completely blurry and we have no idea? But we don't even know that. But again, I to get back to your question, I'm droning on, but I think there are people in the military that really have just looked at this issue and said, there's no winning there. We're not going to figure out the mystery of the universe. And as long as we don't think that they're threatening and, they're about to blow us up, we can focus on a whole lot of other things. And, that's kind of disappointing when you think about it. But as I've said before, the military is an institution that has a box for everything. You take this and you file it in that box, or you follow that directive that you're given by your commander, and it lays out in painstaking detail how you do it. And then you throw them something that is a big question mark. We don't know who it belongs to. We don't know how it works. We don't know if it's real or not. Is it fake? Is it a spoof? What is it? And their head spins. Like, well, what do I do with that? Most people in the military are right side of the brain people, not left side of the brain people. And I think it's the left side of the brain people that tend to be more, well, what is this? We should figure this out. And I think some people are just wired, and the military tends to have a lot of these people wired to tell me the answer, tell me where it fits, tell me whose job it is. And that's another thing. It's nobody's job to do this. Not really. I mean, it was ATIP's job, but ATIP was like this big.
Mm-hmm. So this kind of going down this road a little bit, I've been getting harassed. I know you've been getting harassed by a lot of the UFO community, I guess, on Twitter about some of these kind of fringe conspiracies that have been coming out. But, they're attaching...
I should know better than to tweet about Roswell.
But, they're attaching some of the names of people in Into the Stars, including, some of the scientists, but also even Elizondo has gone on Tucker Carlson and said, I think, there's a piece of a UFO material that the government has. Do you think, with these guys kind of entertaining these kind of more fringe ideas, could that jeopardize their efforts with the Senate or with the, in Washington?
I mean, I think there is a risk that there's certainly a risk that, just because the Overton window is moved doesn't mean that there still isn't the chance that people could get spooked. You know what I mean? If there's, a feeling, I think, up there that somehow they are roaming into territory where they're going to be vilified or made fun of, or there's a political cost to doing this, then they could get scared and run away and say, I don't want to deal with that anymore. And so, I think the more the unproven theories, and I know I'm treading on sort of ice here, but like the more whether they're true or not, the more things like Roswell start getting people to think kooky things. Whether that's justified or not, I think probably doesn't help move the ball in Congress. In other words, if you start, throwing around a lot of conspiracies and interjecting that into the debate, I think it probably reduces the chances that something will change. And I think that's a risk of To the Stars Academy, and we've talked about this before. Tom DeLonge says some pretty, provocative things, which I'm not in a position to say they're true or they're not true, but they don't always garner the best headlines in terms of like being credible among the people that sit on the Senate Intelligence Committee who are presumably going to try to get more answers and at least in theory have the authority to get more answers. Whether they'll actually succeed is a whole other issue. But so it's sort of a tough balance, I guess. But I have learned my lesson not to tweet about Roswell, because the truth is, like, I have a sort of viewpoints of it that are not really based on real knowledge. I mean, I'm not a UFO expert. I'm not a historian. And I've probably watched way too many History Channel programs.
But I think what about for professional journalists to get involved and to tackle all of this is that there are research standards. There's a rigor to the work that a journalist does, a professional journalist in approaching this topic. And to me, that's been great because the information is more pure. It's more well-researched in a lot of cases, such as yours. And so if you are documenting it, it's something that you've researched and vetted much more carefully than your average UFO researcher.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think that's true to a point, but in defense of the UFO research community, I mean, it's in many ways it is a different universe. It's a different playing field with different sort of rules, I guess. And I've really tried in covering this story to sort of stick to what we know in terms of the government paper trail, the money trail. And that's why ATIP was such a good story. It was Congress throwing money effectively to Bob Bigelow to go research this stuff through an earmark, which in most cases would have been, 100% smelly. But because of the topic and the issue, it was like, oh, wow, that's interesting. Maybe it's Congress actually forcing the Pentagon to do something that it's not willing to do in a good way. And so, I've tried to focus on it from a very sort of government policy. What is the government doing? What is it saying? Trying to figure out what the Navy knows. But quite frankly, the UFO community has done, I think, overall a whole better job than I have in actually browbeating the Navy into coughing things up, which is all to the positive. But I think my approach, by definition, is also going to be criticized by some people in the UFO community. And that's totally understandable, and it's totally fine. I mean, I'm operating in sort of a narrower field of view consciously than they are. And so I often get accused of covering up for To the Stars Academy or covering up for the government, or, I'm part of some grand conspiracy to slowly open up the vault, and they're feeding me little things, and I'm just a pawn in their big game. And if I am, I totally am not aware of it, and I'm an idiot because they've been taking advantage of me for 25 years. And so, I think if you just understand that Bryan Bender of Politico is coming at this issue in many ways a more narrow way. It's a big question. We don't know the answer, or at least we don't have enough critical mass of evidence and testimony to say, here's the explanation, irrefutably. But the government's trying to figure it out. At least some elements in the government are trying to figure it out, and they're spending taxpayer dollars to do it. Like, that's worth covering. And like I've said from the beginning, whether you believe these instances are made up, whether you believe they're, some high-tech spoofing job, the UFO equivalent of driving the cat nuts with the laser pointer. If you believe it's a secret Russian aircraft, you believe it's a secret US government program, or you believe in none of the above, which could be, some craft from another planet, from another dimension. I mean, every single one of those is one of the biggest news stories of the era, no matter what the explanation. Even if it's just fake, they've driven the Navy crazy. Whoever has pulled this off has driven them nuts. If it's a secret US government program, and even the most senior people in the intelligence community appear not to know about it, that's a huge story because that's a government within a government. I mean, that would be proof that there's something going on deep, 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 dark inside our intelligence community or our military that even the people that are supposed to know these things don't know. I mean, that to me is a great story. If it's a breakthrough by the Russians or the Chinese or the Israelis or the French or whoever, we probably want that stuff too. So like, that's a huge story. And so that's how I go about it, is like,
Yeah.
I personally don't know what it is, but I feel like whatever it is, it's newsworthy.
Yeah, and that is there concern, you think, with the Senate, or do they care at all that the Air Force, especially, but all of the agencies have been denying researchers or people like me who have written about this information for decades, and essentially telling us there has been no UFO interest anywhere? They send us the fact sheet that says, nope, we haven't been interested in UFOs since 1969, even if we're coming at them with a document that is from 1980. Do you think they're concerned at all that, that denial has been going on for so long, despite that there was really something, there were real investigations and they really did actually take it seriously?
I think I'm pretty sure, and I said this before. I mean, I'm pretty sure that there's been a number of government agencies. I can't prove this, but the Pentagon, the CIA, the FBI, others who have no doubt since 1969 looked into this issue and have followed reports. And there's got to be some paper trail from that, something left over from that. I don't, it's impossible for me to believe that there's nothing. There's got to be stuff. Where it is, who has it, who's aware of it is another question. I think it's also very convenient for them to just deny these FOIAs on grounds of risking national security or revealing sensitive information. And the trick there is they will often deny things, and it's not because the information itself is necessarily all that sensitive. It's this blanket fear that they have, which I think a lot of judges tend to defer to the government on, which is the sources and methods. If we tell you what we know, you could learn how we got it. Did we use a satellite? Did we use some guy with a camera standing across the street? And so that is their excuse all the time. It's sort of like, oh, this is a nothing burger. But if we tell you that we have nothing, or we found something that seems immaterial, you bad guy might figure out how we go about gathering this stuff in the first place. And so it's very easy on this issue for them to, if it's something interfering in protected airspace, they can just say, yeah, it's secret. We can't reveal it. We can't share it with the public. And so that's what's going to be interesting about where this Senate report goes, because it's very specific. Like, they want signals intelligence. And so, anything you gathered through technical means, from satellites, from radars, video, etc. You got to throw that in there too. And that's going to clearly run up against some of these concerns about revealing classified information or revealing sensitive methods. So it'll be interesting to see how they respond to that and how much of they really provide.
Hmm. One question was from the chat. Have you reached out to the NRO?
Not recently. I mean, over the years, I've dealt with the NRO. Not specifically on this issue. I don't think, though, on other issues, and maybe I haven't done my due diligence, but that's always been a black hole for me. I mean, I don't ever remember. I interviewed the head of the NRO once, but that was a very sort of, budget related. Here's the kinds of things that we want to do, and here's why the agency is so critical to the military. And the NRO, as people don't know, I'm sure they do, is basically builds and operates spy satellites, and it's one of the most secret. But you would think that's a logical place for this report to go for information. I mean, if they're looking at the Earth all the time from spy satellites from up in space, presumably they're picking up some of this stuff too. And so, do they keep that? Do they report on those? Do they put them somewhere?
Yep. So, and then there's no more questions from the chat, and I think unless there's more come up, this will be the last question. But the last time we talked was, I guess, a while ago that we did an interview like this, and there's been a big evolution in the DoD's public responses regarding all of this. It's been somewhat schizophrenic in that. At the beginning, they were essentially denying all of the points that you or the New York Times were making about all this project. Since then, other information has come out. They've kind of corrected themselves. They've gone, they really denied everything Elizondo said. Now they've kind of backpedaled on some things, but not any others, and backpedaled on their backpedals. It's been very strange, and everybody who's interacted with them, in particular, Tyler Rogaway wrote a very strong article because he works with these guys every day. And he's like, I've never ran across this sort of thing. Have you found that strange? And what is your take on that?
I mean, it is strange. Some of the things that the Pentagon put out publicly that just didn't ring right. And then, as you said, they've backtracked on. I mean, the only theory that I have, and this is again not really having any direct information, but just having covered the Pentagon for a long time, I feel like one of the major complicating factors in this whole saga was that the ATIP program, which the Pentagon did acknowledge existed, they couldn't deny it. I mean, there was proof that it existed, or at least that the budget item had existed, that there was money set aside for this. Ended in 2012, and Lou Elizondo left the Pentagon in 2017, saying he was head of the UFO office, and there was no UFO office. And so I think, in retrospect, Elizondo probably was a little oversimplistic in describing what his role was. And all of us in the media fell into the trap of Lou Elizondo, the former head of the Pentagon UFO office. Or, that was sort of the layman's way of describing ATIP. But ATIP technically had been dead for 5 years. And so I think that, I guess I theorized that led to a whole series of sort of Keystone Cop kind of response from the Pentagon, where they went back and said, what did Mr. Elizondo do? Where did he work? And if you look at his actual fitness report, as they would call it, like, his kind of work history in the Pentagon, there's no reference to him being UFO guy on that paperwork, because he works for the Undersecretary of Intelligence. He was doing interrogation stuff involving Guantanamo detainees. He had other jobs. And so if you're just sticking to the facts, you say, well, Elizondo didn't have that role in these years. And so it started, I think, to sort of unravel his story. Even though his story was basically true, I think it was sort of a little opening there where it sort of fell apart for a while, where you had the Pentagon officially saying, well, we don't have evidence that he was doing what he was saying he was doing. I mean, we do know that he was read into ATIP. We've seen the memo from Harry Reid from whenever that was, 2009. And, you know, I think when all said and done, his story has held up. What he was doing and why he was doing it has held up. I don't really have a good explanation. That's my best explanation, is that, again, I think there was this kind of false sense that ATIP was sort of this distinct office with a staff, and people worked there, and somebody came in every morning and said, "Hi, boss, what are we doing today?" And it belies the way a lot of the intelligence business works. It's a portfolio. It's a mission. And so, you know, I think, quite frankly, Elizondo kept on this issue, probably with some wink and a nod from some superiors, like, okay, you're going to still be looking into that. That's fine. Just make sure it doesn't, you know, take away from all your other responsibilities. And then I think there were some people who were like, Lou Elizondo's the nut job in the office. He's still obsessed with UFOs. And so I also think that the Pentagon press office, in trying to figure out what the story was, like any place where there's factions, I think they were also getting two different stories. There were probably people who thought Elizondo was too obsessed with this, and it was, you know, it's all he talked about and it's all he wanted to do. And then there were probably other people who said, yeah, you know, he sort of had permission from his superiors to, you know, keep pulling this string and to see where it led. So I think that could have explained it too, that, you know, he had friends and enemies on the inside after he was gone, and some threw him under the bus and others didn't. And I think in the end, though, they came to the conclusion, like the rest of us, that his story generally is true. He was part of that original ATIP office. I don't think he ran it necessarily. I mean, I guess maybe he was the only guy doing it, so that therefore he's running it. And then there was those 5 years from 2012 to 2017 where he was doing this mission or doing this intelligence gathering job, but there wasn't really any sort of formal thing that existed like it did when it was, quote unquote, the ATIP office.
You make a really good point there, and I think in his, I want people to think that it was just him as a hobbyist doing this as a hobby there at the Pentagon. So, but at the same time, you're right, it wasn't this big department. So in his description, he's trying to say, well, no, this wasn't tiny. I had other people that I was coordinating with, even if they weren't staffers on this project or something like that. So yeah, I think it makes sense that a lot would get lost in translation.
Right. You know, and if you know anything about working in the federal government, I mean, you could probably show up to work and play crossword puzzles every day for 5 years, and that's how long it would take for them to remove you, because the process of removing a federal employee is so onerous that, you know, it would, you know, you probably could get away with just not doing your job for a long time before it would. And I'm not suggesting that that's what Lou was doing, but I'm just saying that I think he had a keen interest in this issue, and he clearly must have had some buy-in from other people that it was okay to do this with your time or some of your time. But I think there's, and maybe some of us in the mainstream media are partially to blame for this perception that there was like this big, you know, secret office that the Pentagon eventually said, oh, well, Elizondo had nothing to do with that. I mean, it just wasn't that simple.
But the results, I mean, for you, this has got to be kind of a bit shocking too, because there's the Mellons story, which is pretty impressive that he made this all come about. You know, there's a whole team of the Bigelow lot who were able to make this come about. But the Elizondo story is really interesting too, in that he left his job to get the word out, and he did. And the DOD jumped on him, denied everything he had said. Eventually, what he had said came out to be the fact, and now not only does the world know about it, and it's a big story, now the Senate Intelligence Committee is asking for a report on UAPs, which was essentially his whole task. And we know that the whole department or project he was working on has expanded into this multi-agency sort of group headed up by the ONI. So, I mean, the results of all of this is kind of staggering, I feel.
Yeah, I mean, if you believe, as I do, that Elizondo left the government frustrated that this was an issue that was not getting enough attention, and he was going to go public to try and get some attention and ally himself with people like Chris Mellon and Tom DeLonge and others who were, clearly trying to get traction as well. I think, by all accounts, he's been very successful so far. I mean, I think what your definition of success is probably determines, where you sit in this. In other words, ultimately success would be the government coughs up everything it knows and we have the answers we want. But to me, the success has been forcing the issue, getting people to pay attention, not just, more of the public, but policymakers to pay attention. And I think this latest thing is probably the clearest, I think not even probably, I think it's undoubtedly the clearest piece of evidence that their strategy is succeeding. It's accomplishing one of the main goals that they had, which was to get this on the agenda in a public way that it hasn't been for a long, long time. And it'll be interesting. I mean, I've sort of been covering a lot of other things, and I've been sort of keeping tabs on this. And like I said, filing some FOIAs, trying to see what more we could learn. But for us at Politico, I think there's now a real storyline to follow now. Again, kind of in a way that there was in 2017 when we found out about ATIP. What is the Senate going to do? What is the House going to do? Does this get in the bill? If it does, what does the president do? And then if it becomes law, the bigger question, what do the actual agencies do? How do they answer the mail on this? Do they? And this is, and what's great about the language is that, it's not just do a report and get back to us. It's like 180 days. There's a timeline. So we in the press can, sort of bird dog it. Say, okay, well, where is that thing? Where is that public report? Mm-hmm. Who's writing it? Are there agencies, and this, we'll take some source reporting, but are there agencies that are more resistant than others as this plays out? Why is that? Well, the Air Force gave you this and it was 2 pages long and that's it. The Navy gave you 4,000 pages. The CIA gave you nothing. Well, why? And that's obviously not just my job. It's the job of people in your community too. I mean, who've, like I said, done a better job, I think, than a lot of the media in getting them to cough up even just incremental stuff that, adds another paintbrush stroke to the painting. Anyway,
Right.
I hope that's helpful.
It is. It's very helpful.
Love talking to you.
So let's see. Adam says and the DNI and how they're going to manage all the different players. It's a great question, and I think that it will be interesting to see all the different responses. Some more helpful than others, no doubt. I wonder if they're going to ask Space Commander.
Well, it's interesting. One thing I would keep an eye on is I don't think they've scheduled it yet, but the Senate Intelligence Committee every year at least once a year, has this one of their few public hearings. They don't do a lot of public hearings, but it's called the Worldwide Threats Hearing, and it's the DNI. I think some of the other heads of intelligence agencies, maybe the CIA, the DIA, the Defense Intelligence Agency, and others. They come for a public session where they sort of do around the world the state of the globe and what does the threat environment look like. And that's a hearing that normally is never controversial, but it's become controversial because Dan Coates, who was the DNI in the first bunch of years, the first couple of years of the Trump administration, he got in trouble with the boss because he said some things in there that, basically went against what the president was saying about, for example, the strength of ISIS. Trump was saying we have defeated ISIS. His DNI was saying, well, not so fast. Here's why we think they're still a threat, et cetera. So since then, the committee hasn't held that hearing. And Republicans control the Senate, so they're in charge. I think if the Democrats were in charge, they would have held it again. But there's been talk just in the last 48 hours about doing that hearing again before the August recess, because obviously the coronavirus pandemic, all of these other things that are going on in terms of this global crisis, the committee wants to hear from the leaders of the intelligence community, and they now have a new leader, John Radcliffe, the former congressman who I mentioned, who's the DNI. And so I'm going to watch that, not just because it's worthwhile watching in and of itself, but Marco Rubio chairs that committee. So he's chairing that hearing. And it's John Radcliffe that would do this report. So, does he have the ball, so to speak, to ask about this in public? I don't know. It'd be something that, I wouldn't be surprised if Chris Mellon, his dream is that Marco Rubio in a couple of weeks when they have this hearing brings it up, gets him on the record, Radcliffe on the record, at least pledging to do this and, to do what the committee wants, which gets to the last question here, which is like, how does he corral all these other agencies into participating in this? Because, the DNI basically is, oversees 17 intelligence agencies. So, again, I'm just throwing that out there because you never know, but
no, something to look out for. And that's what's great, because you've been able to capture some really interesting comments here and there, conventions or other gatherings.
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely, if nothing else, this keeps this on the agenda, and keep the George Stephanopoulos and the Tucker Carlsons and whoever else asking senior people, including the president, who, like I said, I mean, I don't know what to make of what Trump thinks, because the truth is he never says anything. He never says anything. Oh, that's interesting. Oh, I saw the reports. Oh, when his son asked him, are you going to release all that stuff? He just sort of kind of laughed it off. I personally don't think he knows much at all. That's my sense. Is if he had a briefing, it was like every other briefing he gets, which, if you believe the reports from people who work for him, he doesn't really pay attention. And unless he's really interested in this issue, I don't know, how much data he's really getting. He certainly could get it if he wanted it.
He, a purely political animal, really. And his first response was that, they told me something about it, but I don't think much of it, and I'm letting the Navy look into it, was probably his most honest answer. So it doesn't seem like he thinks much of it.
Yeah.
The reason he would pick it up is if he found some sort of political reason to do that might help his campaign.
He's much more into earthbound conspiracy theories.
Right. And not that that's necessarily a criticism, of course.
I'll get criticized for saying that, but
but it's true. So I think that is it. Or I guess the last question, where does Mellon go from here?
know. I mean, I assume, like I said earlier, this will just embolden him to continue to be a public voice on this, advocating for more research, more information, and he, I think he walks that line between, could this be a national security threat, and could this explain the mystery of the universe? I mean, he sort of talks about both, and I think he does it pretty effectively. And he's got at least the credibility within that establishment community, where I think, at least so far, they take him seriously, and I'm pretty sure, I don't know this 100%, but I'm pretty sure without Chris Mellon, this provision doesn't exist.
Mm-hmm.
Because he's the one who's really pushed this idea of step one is to just pull together what we know, or what we think we know, and what we're doing about this government wide. And it's not inconceivable that would have happened anyway, but doubtful, I think.
Yeah. So season 2 of Unidentified, one of the things that's coming up, which Chris Mellon, I know plays a bigger role. I've heard something about the production. I was supposed to actually potentially be interviewed in it, but they had to cut it short from the pandemic. And somebody asked, "Are you in it?" Because you were in the first season.
I am not in it. I'm not in it. They asked me to be in it a while back, and basically my position was, I think for the first season, which was a lot about the revelations of the office and who Lou was and how this sort of interesting cast of characters came together, that was reporting that I had done, and spent quite a bit of time on. So I felt like, as a journalist, okay, this is something I'm knowledgeable of. And when they came to me for season 2, I was like, well, what am I going to talk about? What do you want me to talk about? I'm not a UFO expert. I mean, I can certainly talk about a little bit of, what I'd like to learn, what more I'd like to do on this subject as a beat reporter who covers the Pentagon. But I just didn't feel like there was a whole lot that I could add. I also, the first season, quite frankly, I was as surprised as anybody. I mean, they interviewed me for 2 or 3 hours one day. They came to the Politico newsroom in Washington, and I think I was in every episode. So I was like amazed that they were able to slice and dice what was effectively one lengthy conversation to make it appear like I was sort of on the set all the time. I wasn't at all. But I haven't given up on the issue. I mean, I certainly want to cover it, and like I said, there's more reason to cover it now, especially for Politico, for our publication, which tries to own Congress, and how screwed up that place is, and what they're doing and not doing. And this is obviously in the mix now, again, in a formal way, which it really wasn't. I mean, the last time that we know of Congress did anything like this was in 2007 or 8, when Harry Reid created ATIP. And so now there's something potentially on the books that, like I said, we can start covering and see where it goes.
Mm-hmm. It's a great story. I mean, Mellon's storyline is great. Lou's is great. Tom DeLonge, this rock star, how did he get in the midst of all these intelligence guys and helping to make this all happen? It's an incredible story, so it's definitely worth covering.
For sure.
Well, thank you so much.
Alejandro.
Thank you for your coverage and breaking all of this great news that you do break, and paying attention to all of this from your perspective, which especially now is an important one, since really the ball's in kind of your wheelhouse in the Senate there. So we'll keep an eye on this. And thank you so much for making the time to talk to me and answer all of these questions.
Yeah,
I think
of course.
These are really important questions right now.
Sounds good.
All right. Thanks. We'll be in touch.
Have a good one.
See ya.
Oh, quick question. Is there any way since I haven't been able to scroll through every question that came in while we were talking, is there a
Uh-huh.
way to capture that so I can, like, if I log out, will I lose all that? Because it would be
I
nice
think
to just read through all the comments.
I'll do my best. I'll see. I think there is.
Okay,
I know
if
they're
not,
going to.
no worries.
Actually, when you log out, you'll be able to come back in and read all of them. So you can read them when you come
Cool.
back in.
Sounds good.
Now I remember that. All right.
Okay, thanks.
Talk to you later. Thank you.
Over and out.